Hello again, everybody. This is Cammie Peterson with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Welcome to our webinar today, Massachusetts Cities and Towns Improving Codes for Climate. So we're excited to have you all here today for really what we say is our kickoff to our Codes for Climate effort this year. And one of the big keystones of that is informing all of you on the phone and hopefully many more beyond that on how you can get involved in affecting the nationwide code this year. So we'll talk much more about that as we go. First off, we're going to tell you just a little bit about who we are for any of those on the line who aren't yet familiar. Metropolitan Area Planning Council is the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. You can see here on this slide that we serve 101 cities and towns of Metro Boston, about half of the state's population here, nearly 3.2 million residents, and many of the jobs here too in Massachusetts come through our region. So a big, diverse, large region that we work with on land use, sustainability, clean energy, public health, economic development, housing, transportation, and more. In our clean energy department, we've been working over the years in a number of ways, helping cities and towns with climate mitigation, energy efficiency, renewable energy projects, plans, and programs. You can see here a number of the buckets that we've been working in, both one-on-one with communities as well as regionally, and providing a good amount of technical assistance, education, and outreach as well. One of the big programs that we launched a little over a year ago is our work on net zero, and we've been calling that effort Net Zero, or 0 to 101, bringing net zero to 101 cities and towns and beyond. So really working both from the fundamental levels of net zero to really getting towns to achieve the ambitious climate goals that they set. We've been working on that as a very holistic effort. We see it as a systems-based type of framework that's needed really to achieve the potential of net zero. And there are many multiple benefits that come from working on net zero through this type of lens in our eyes. So you can see here a list of the many ways that you can think of the benefits that come from approaching net zero as a holistic framework for climate planning. So one of the big reasons that we're now focusing on codes is the effect that buildings have as part of reaching net zero. Buildings can be a very large part of a greenhouse gas emissions inventory of one's carbon footprint per se. So you see here on the left the Massachusetts pie chart for greenhouse gas emissions by sector as updated through 2015. And buildings are nearly a third of the emissions from the entire state. Transportation's a bigger chunk, electricity slightly smaller, but buildings are a very large piece. And it's been that thermal sector in particular, the heating and cooling of buildings, that has been a really challenging sector to get at, and one that we see as a really important sector to find ways to tackle through our net zero efforts. The pie chart on the right looks at the U.S. kind of pie, and they don't reflect it in the same way, so we're not able to show you buildings per se in this pie chart. But you can look at the commercial and residential and industry sectors as a large part of those being the heating and cooling costs, and a lot of the electricity is going toward buildings as well. So the point here being made that buildings are a very large part of our greenhouse gas emissions, both as a state and as a country. And one of the big ways that we can affect that is through building code. So we'll talk more in detail about this, but the point here that we wanted to make and the way we wanted to set the table for our discussion today is to really kind of help focus our efforts in on the impact that buildings can have and the way we, as stakeholders here in Massachusetts, can affect the building code to help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to be a very big strategic tool for the way that we approach reducing greenhouse gas emissions in our communities, in the state, in the Northeast region, in the country, and throughout the globe. We have been working on this effort with a number of partners as we look at building codes. They're listed here on the screen: the Mass Climate Action Network, Sierra Club, the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, who we'll hear from a little bit later, and the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership. So today we're going to walk you through some building code basics. We're going to talk about how the nationwide Model Energy Code, the International Energy Conservation Code, which is IECC that you see there, how that can serve as a real change maker in this climate space. We're then going to talk about how you can get involved, how you can work on affecting the IECC and the role that can play here in Massachusetts and in our communities. We'll talk about some next steps because we're launching this effort, which will continue over the next year, and we'll have a little time at the end for questions.
And we have two quick housekeeping things. So if you have any questions as we're going through these sections, please write them into the Q&A section on your browser, and we'll get to those at the end. And then the other thing is we're recording this webinar so that you can have this as a resource later, and we'll be sending the slides out afterwards as well.
Thank you, Nicole. That was Nicole Sanchez, my colleague here at MAPC, and you'll be hearing more from her later on in the webinar. So building code basics. Some of you might be very familiar with the building code, but others might still be asking, what exactly is that? You know, I've heard of it, but I don't really know. So at the most basic level, as the definition here from FEMA tells us, building codes are really a set of regulations that address the structural integrity, safety exits, lighting, ventilation, construction materials, and so on. How buildings are built really to protect health, safety, and general welfare. Here in Massachusetts, by statute, we have to adopt and fully integrate the latest IECC, that International Energy Conservation Code. So that's our building energy code here in Massachusetts. It's primarily made up of this nationwide model energy code, the IECC, which right away tells you why that is so important to the work that we do here in Massachusetts. The Board of Building Regulations and Standards, the BBRS, who oversees the building code, along with the Department of Energy Resources, who consults with them, really adopts in large part this IECC and then adds amendments to that as long as they are more stringent energy efficiency provisions. Now, many of you are familiar with the stretch code and know that, as you can see here, it's now up to 250 cities and towns, which is outstanding, in the Commonwealth that have adopted the stretch energy code. So what is that and how does it relate to the base building code? So the base building energy code is superseded then by the stretch energy code if a community opts to adopt it. And as you can see, only 101 have not yet opted to adopt it out of our 351 here in Massachusetts over the last 8 years or so. And so a community can adopt by the town meeting or by city council to adopt the stretch code in their community. It used to be a full appendix to the base building code. It now has been embedded, the most recent versions, into the base building energy code itself, but it still is a slightly more progressive version of the building energy code here in Massachusetts. If you do not choose as a community to adopt the stretch code, then you function under the base building energy code, that model code that's adopted by the state with the amendments made by the Board of Building Regulations and Standards with consultation by the Department of Energy Resources. If you do choose to adopt the stretch code, then there are a few additional provisions or options that you will then have that your community is then responsible for enforcing. And you then, for any stretch code updates in the future, automatically are updated to that stretch code as well, unless your community chooses to rescind the stretch code and again has to go through either town meeting or city council in order to do that. So those are a number of ways that our cities and towns, through the state process, work on buildings, what kind of governs how we deal with the buildings that are built in our communities. Unlike some other states, many other states, where cities and towns have the ability to adopt their own building code, we do not have that ability in Massachusetts beyond choosing to opt up into the stretch energy code. Those are our only two options here on the building code level. So there are still ways that we can impact the building regulations, the governance of buildings here in Massachusetts. The one that we're going to focus on throughout this webinar today, that's a tool that has been underutilized in Massachusetts and throughout the country, is that first green box, the IECC. And many stakeholders in your municipalities are eligible to become part of the International Code Council and vote on the IECC. So it's a power that has not really yet been utilized. Though at any time, any of our stakeholders in Massachusetts, whether municipal staff members or not, can comment on the base building energy code and the stretch energy code through the Board of Building Regulations and Standards process, the BBRS that I referenced. You also adopt the stretch energy code if a community chooses to, as well as other zoning and local ordinances. So let's not forget about the other tools in a community's toolbox that are local tools in the form of zoning and permitting and fees for inspections and so on. There are definitely many tools at the local level. And then enforcement. All of these then require enforcement at the local level. And so that's another way that cities and towns can impact the way that buildings are governed and developed in their communities. And they're all very important pieces. The one that we think has not been quite as utilized as it could and should be is the IECC that we're here to talk about today, and the one that there's a window to really have a much larger impact on and really affect how not only Massachusetts adopts a new building energy code come the next go around to do so, which would be the 2021 code, but also affects how most other states in the country will adopt the building energy code, is that green one, the International Energy Conservation Code. So we're excited to tell you about your ability to impact that today. One last slide I wanted to show you to kind of set the context a little more is just also how energy code improves the home. So when we were speaking to the safety, the public welfare, the health benefits, or the requirements of what a building code does, an energy efficient code accomplishes a lot of those, checks a lot of those boxes. So you can see here from this nice graphic, not put together by us, but by MEEA, all of the ways, or some of the ways, there are more even, that an energy code that is pro-efficiency can really help to improve a home, can improve the livability of it, can improve the air quality and the ventilation, the comfort levels, the daylighting. There are so many numerous ways that it can provide comfort and safety, better public health outcomes through a strong energy efficient code, let alone the climate outcomes that we know come from more energy efficiency. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker today, Bill Fay with the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, to tell you all more about the work that his organization has done and the ability for the IECC to be a change maker here in Massachusetts and across the country. Bill?
Well, thank you very much, Cammie. I appreciate the introduction. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Oh, good. I think this is going to be a very exciting year next year, and we're very excited about also what Massachusetts has done, not only up to this point, but also as a leader for the nation. I often tell your Department of Energy Resources that we like stealing from some of your ideas to try to get that into the code for other states, and so you've been a great model for us, and we're just so excited to be working with you. So the goal here today is putting the IECC, not only the one that we're going to do next year, the 2021 IECC, on a 10% boost in efficiency for commercial, residential, and multifamily buildings, but also to try to put the IECC itself on a glide path of steady gains that get us to net zero buildings at some point in time. And I think, as Cammie very aptly pointed out, the building energy policy is something that is in the hands of local governments and state governments to really make the decisions. It's governmental officials that actually cast the vote for the IECC in a year-long process, and that will all be determined a year from now. So let's click to the next slide, and I'll tell you about the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition. It's a very bizarre organization because a lot of these groups don't necessarily speak to one another if they pass in the halls, and it makes us an unlikely coalition. But you take a look at who's in it. We have governmental entities like the state energy offices as supporters. It's not surprising, we have big energy efficiency groups. But, one of the things that the opponents of efficiency point to is the added cost of efficiency without paying much attention to the fact that that added cost is an investment that puts thousands of dollars in the wallets of the homeowners and the renters that are in the building. But affordable housing advocates, we have 5 of those nationally that are supporting EECC, and you wonder, if anybody cares about the added first cost of efficiency, it should be low-income housing. Well, so why is low-income housing interested in this? Well, first of all, they realize that the highest cost of home ownership outside of the mortgage principal and interest is energy. It's higher than taxes, it's higher than insurance, and they also know that it's the least predictable cost because it's gauged by weather. And so what happens is a low-income family tends to fall behind in their energy bills during heat waves or cold snaps, when those bills kind of start mounting up, and then and then in addition to that, the low-income housing advocates data shows that the leading reason for foreclosure of homes outside of losing your job is inability to pay the energy bill. So it's not surprising when you really look at that data why a low-income housing advocate would be supporting this effort. We all understand why environmental groups are there, but in addition to that, over recent decades, we've made such strides, I think, as a nation in developing innovative practices and products, and it's important that the codes integrate those practices and products, because when a building inspector goes into a home that's energy efficient, they have to be able to recognize those technologies or they can't approve the home for the home permit. And so it's important that we get those technologies and practices into the code when they're ready to be in there. Business and insurance, so you can understand why business is tied in, because a lot of that innovation with products and practices come from them. Another interesting part is the utilities. You know, you'd think that if we build energy efficient buildings, that's going to reduce the revenues of utilities, and so they should be our opponents, right? Well, when it really comes down to it, what energy efficient buildings do is they stabilize those peaks, and that allows the utilities to be more productive with the amount of energy that they generate. So we have support from not only the investor-owned utilities, but also public power and the rural electric co-ops. And lastly, consumer groups understand that right now families are struggling. This is always a challenge for not only low income, but other families around the nation, and they know that having that reduction or that stability in their energy bill is a really, really critical element. So let's go to the next slide then. And so you'll notice that EECC was formed back in, it was actually 2007. It was right after the 2006 IECC was developed. And the reason that we were formed is you can see a pretty flat history prior to us getting together. In fact, it was a little over 20 years that the IECC was rather flat. Every 3 years that it was renewed, it had 1 or 2% gains. When we did organize, we really did. We were able in just 2 code cycles to get what really amounts to about a 38% improvement in residential efficiency, about a 35% reduction in or improvement in commercial building efficiency. And so then, right after that, the opponents of efficiency started to go to the International Code Council, and they changed the structure of the committees that make the recommendations. And that change has been significant because it's stifled the adoption of new pro-efficiency proposals, both in the 2015 and the 2018 IECC. What will happen is if that business as usual continues, and you can see the dotted line moving out to the right, you're going to see that we really aren't going to get to our goals. And so let me click to the next slide, because I want to talk about the mayors, because they played a huge role in the glide path concept. You know, you start thinking about what kind of glide path are we talking about? Okay, glide path to net zero buildings, but you know, actually you could call it a glide path to home and commercial building affordability. You could call it a glide path to stabilizing utility costs and grids. You could call it a glide path to U.S. energy independence and security. There's a lot of data that shows that improving efficiency is the most effective way of reducing carbon emissions. And so it's a glide path to meeting the Paris climate targets. And of course, lastly, it's a glide path to net zero commercial and residential and multifamily buildings. So the mayors started recognizing this. I'd like to say that take all the credit for these improvements that we've made, but I think the mayors were so critical. And what happened was the first time that we met with them right after we formed, the mayor of Austin, Texas, looked out over the mayors that were there and said, how many of you knew that America's model energy code is renewed every 3 years? And no one raised their hand. And so Mayor Wynn from Austin said, and how many of you knew, like Bill just told you, that it's your employees, it's the people that work for your city that actually vote on the new energy code. And again, none of the mayors really knew that. And so what started then was Mayor Wynn led an effort. It's been supported by a number of Massachusetts mayors and mayors from all around the country. And we've seen unanimous adoptions of resolutions in 2008, 2010, 2013, 2016 that called for putting the IECC on a glide path and doing more each code cycle. And then in 2018, they passed a resolution that was just this last June in Boston, where they linked the fact that the mayors have a very strong position on carbon reduction and meeting the Paris Accord. They also have a strong position on building energy efficiency, and they know that building energy efficiency is one of the most effective and impactful ways to do that. So mayors are engaged, and I think that really makes a difference, in terms of kind of telling us how we can proceed. Next slide. Now, you wonder, I told you about this impediment that the efficiency opponents kind of threw in the way. We figured it out the other day that if, in fact, the last code, the last IECC, which was passed in 2016, it's the 2018 IECC, if we'd had 522 new votes, additional votes, in November, for the 2018 IECC recommendations that we're going to be submitting, and it's a voting guide that is endorsed by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. 522 votes nationwide, we would have ended up with a 2018 IECC that was 10% more efficient instead of one that had very little improvement. And so now you can see why we're here. We believe. And when you take a look at it, MAPC has 101 jurisdictions. Each of them get at least 4 votes. You're getting us awfully close to that 522 just with the MAPC members. But we know that that in addition to that, the Massachusetts Climate Action Network and Sierra Club are working on the other jurisdictions there. So you can see that we really can make a difference if we just simply vote on the IECC. Next slide. And that difference can be measured in a lot of different ways. This particular point deals with carbon emissions. You could also have a point about how much money it puts in the wallets of homeowners, or how much stability you get from grids. But you can see that if business as usual continues, our improvements in carbon are not going to be as great as they need to be. Your votes are going to make a difference for that. Next slide. And again, this is the same data kind of laid out in how many tons of billions of tons of avoidable of CO2 that you could actually get if you cast this vote and move this to a glide path. Next slide. And so you can see the big dot over Massachusetts, and you see a big dot over California, which is where I am right now. And earlier this last month, we were organizing efforts in the I-5 corridor in Washington and Oregon. We are reaching out all across the country to get those 522 votes. And frankly, our goal is 522 votes, but we'd love to see every single eligible code official, not code official, but building governmental official at the local or state level that is eligible to vote on the IECC actually cast those votes. And so you'll see that we are focused very aggressively around the country on some very, very important venues. And I think that's the end of my presentation right now. I've got to tell you that your help. Not only have you already kind of set the pace for the nation, but your help now in improving America's model energy code is going to make a tremendous difference really down the road.
Thanks so much, Bill. This is Nicole here, so I'm gonna just give us a little overview and a little bit more detail about how to get ready to and actually register to vote for this year's IECC Code Cycle. So this is what the timeline looks like for the IECC Code for 2019. So we don't have all of these dates yet, but the part that we're focused on right now is this next piece. So we have 3 months, so January, February, and March, for the primary voters for each governmental member to register with the International Code Council to vote. So that deadline is March 29th. And then once we have those primary voters registered, then we have this time over the summer where voters within each governmental member are identified by the primary representative. And then next fall, we think this voting window will be in November. So it's a 2-week voting window when you'll be able to have all the voters within the governmental member vote online for this code. So I know I threw out just now a bunch of very confusing terms, so I'm going to just break those down a little bit. So governmental voting members, these are the groups of voters, and so the number of voters per group is based on the population of your city or town. So if you have less than 50,000 people, then each group has 4 voters allowed. If you have 50,000 to 150,000, then you have 8 allowed per group. And if you have more than 150,000, you would have 12 voters allowed per group. So to give you an example about how this would work, here are 3 different departments that might be within the same town. So each department would be a governmental member, and then each department would have these 4 voters within them. The green is showing the primary voters, so within that group of 4, and the blue are the other voters that the primary voter is going to identify. So the primary voters we're really focused on for the January to March timeline because they have to register by that March 29th deadline. If the primary voter doesn't register the governmental member, so that group or department, by that deadline, then we can't put in other voters in that department for this code cycle. The other important role that the primary voter is serving is determining the eligibility of the other voters in that department. And then, like I said before, during that window over the summer, they're going to be signing up the other voters within their group. So I think one of the biggest questions we've been getting is how do we know which voters are eligible? So this is an excerpt from the ICC guidelines. So to be eligible, the voting representative should be an employee or official of that governmental member, actively engaged full or part-time in the administration, formulation, or enforcement of laws, regulations, or ordinances relating to public health, safety, and welfare. So that could be a lot of different types of departments depending on what those departments are working on within your municipality. So things that we're focused on are people who have been working on adopting the stretch code or enforcing the stretch code, and especially as that relates to health, safety, and welfare. So that could be a planning department as well. So we have some different examples of what that could look like. And then something that's important to keep in mind as you're planning on which departments might be good fits for this is the membership fees. So these, again, are based on population. So these are the break those down into the same groups. And this membership fee is per governmental member. So each department that you're registering needs this fee. So if you have less than 50,000 people for the population of your town, so those 4-person groups, then each 4-person group would pay a $135 membership fee. So we want to just plan for that up front so that in March when those fees are due, you'll have those ready to go. And then I just wanted to give you an idea of what this page looks like. So this is on the International Code Council website, and this is the spot where you would renew your membership if a department already had one, or start a new membership for a new governmental member. And I have some links in here that I'll send out after this for specific pages that would be helpful for going through this process. So let's talk about some next steps. So you should think about how to engage different municipal departments. Stay tuned with us for more resources and webinars that we'll be putting out, as well as our partners that we mentioned before on the IECC process. Start to think about and identify eligible departments that could serve as governmental members. We want to budget for those registration fees. Select the primary voting representatives, so those important people that need to register before March 29th. Make sure that they register before March 29th, and then reach out to us for any help navigating this process. We know it can be a little bit complicated and there's a lot of little details. So if you feel lost at any point, we're happy to help you walk through it or sort through some of those details.
I think what would be helpful here too, and we've left a good amount of time for any questions that might have arisen. We have a number in our Q&A window here that we'll take a look at and start to go through in a moment. But today, or following this webinar, if you have suggestions for us on the types of materials or the interventions that could be most helpful or useful to you or your community in helping to understand this or take part in any of these steps, it'd be great if you could let us know. If that's having kind of open office hours where you can call us and take 25 minutes to kind of talk through the different departments and entities in your municipality that may be eligible and you want to see, do we think they are, how would you go about that? We're happy to do that. Or if there's materials that would be really useful in kind of spelling out different sections of this process, or if it's going to sit down with a certain other, person or staff member in your community, happy to do those things as well, or find ways to really address those needs. So as Nicole said, we'll be rolling out more resources as we go, but we'd love that to be informed by your feedback and what would be most useful to you so that we can register as many governmental member voting representatives within the next couple of months. Starting January 1st through March 29th is the window that will be open for governmental members to register. And just to reiterate before we get into the Q&A, it's not at that point that you have to register every single person who will vote. You really just have to register the entity in each community, and that could be one or it could be multiple entities, and we encourage multiple. It could be that planning department, that sustainability department, a public health office, the mayor's office. It could be multiple departments or entities within your municipality that fit within that loose definition of what makes for an eligible voter or an eligible governmental member. And that governmental member needs someone who will then serve as the primary representative to register by March 29th. You then have months until that September deadline to determine who those 4, 8, or 12 total voting representatives in each governmental member, in each planning department, sustainability department, and so on, will be that will then vote in November. And it's usually the second half of November, a 2-week window, and we'll have more details as the International Code Council determines that date later in the year, or those dates. But we do know it'll be the middle of November where those 2 weeks will be set aside, and you'll really just need to find one day to sit down at that point in front of a computer. And you'll only need about an hour, maybe Put aside 2 hours, so you only need about an hour or so to sit down. We'll have guidance, as Bill mentioned, that will be endorsed by the U.S. Conference of Mayors and many other groups as part of the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition on which provisions, which pro-efficiency provisions within the IECC for 2021 you should vote on, that we're suggesting, recommending that you vote on. And if there, there very likely will be some that would roll back efficiency measures or efficiency improvements. And so we would recommend that one vote against those. We'll have all those very clearly delineated so that you can sit down together, plan a pizza party or whatnot. Everyone has their laptops, does its voting in an hour on one of those November days, and makes a big impact on the energy efficiency level of the building code that we here in Massachusetts will have and that many other states throughout the country will have, and the carbon footprint then of our buildings going forward, putting us on that glide path that Bill was really discussing. So we see a relatively small lift in terms of having to register, pay that relatively nominal fee, identify your eligible voters, sit down for an hour with the guidance, and go through the voting process in order to make a very large impact on the efficiency and carbon footprint of our buildings into the future. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Nicole to kind of help us see some of the questions that folks had that we can try to address today. And if we can't address it today, we'll find a way to get back to you soon.
Yeah, and so I'm going to go out of order because we had a question that just came through that's very relevant to what we were just talking about. So the question was, when a new code is proposed, what kind of guidance will we get towards voting, because many of us are not code experts. So there is that small window for the actual voting, online voting, but right before that, we will be working with our partners, because Bill can talk about this in a little bit more detail, but they'll be working to put together a voting guide for the IECC, because most of us are not code experts, or if we are, might not be experts on this specific code. So that will give a good guideline for what the effect will be of different proposals for the IECC, and what those benefits could be to vote for or against some of those codes that code proposals that we're really focused on.
Bill, do you want to add any more to that?
Absolutely. I think that, the great thing that EECC has that I absolutely love is smart people. I'm not one of them, but these are people who really understand the codes and what they're going to do. We engage a group called ICF International. It's one of the greatest energy analytics firms in the world, and they do independent analyses of all of the proposals that are out there. And there will be several hundred proposals to vote on. But what we do is we have a very simple yardstick to measure each of those 200 or 300 proposals. We first determine whether or not they improve efficiency or weaken it. If they weaken it, obviously that's an easy decision. We want you to vote against those. But even in the areas where they improve things, we want to make sure that the code has the code proposal is offering up something that is readily available, because we don't want to put technologies in there that aren't available to the builder. The great news is we have a number of states that have done so much that we have great examples of products and practices that really are working. And then what we do is we'll determine not only those that improve, but sometimes there will be 5 or 6 proposals that try to do the same thing, and we will evaluate which one we think is going to be the most effective one, regardless of who wrote it, and then make the recommendation that you go with that. We also are aware of the fact that when you vote, and this is during a 2-week period that'll probably be between November 13th and November 27th, we're aware that your time is limited. And so do you remember that slide that I showed you where it said if these votes changed outcome, we would have ended up with a 2018 IECC that was 10% more efficient? Well, we're going to be doing that again. We will tell you, we'll identify the 25 or 30 proposals that have the greatest impact, both positive and negative, on efficiency, and we'll give you that cheat sheet first. That'll be your voting guide first. And if you only have 15 minutes or 20 minutes to vote, as opposed to the hour that DOER says that it normally takes to vote on a number of proposals, you'll be able to just vote on those that have the greatest amount of impact. And so the great news is we have very smart people. It's groups like the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Sierra Club. It's state energy offices. It's experts in the field. Not only analytic independent experts around the country, and they gather together and develop this voting guide. It was interesting at one MAPC meeting, the Department of Energy Resources in Massachusetts said that they did the same thing. That they went through the 300 and some odd proposals just like we did and developed a voting guide, and they said that they only differed from our voting guide on one proposal. So we do have a good track record, and it's one of the reasons that the mayors are so supportive of what we're doing. When you have a simple yardstick of whether or not it improves efficiency and vote for the way that does it the best, and then vote against those things that roll back efficiency, it makes it kind of easy to make those measurements. So we will be getting that voting guide out to MAPC and Massachusetts Climate Action Network and Sierra Club and everybody in advance, to make it as easy as possible. And I also love the idea that Cammie just mentioned about pizza. I think that helps certainly while away the hour while you're voting together. I even believe that that DOER in Massachusetts will have maybe some videos, or we'll do some webinars that show you how to vote. And so there may be a podcast or something that just says, okay, turn on your laptop, log in, do this, and try to make the voting process itself as easy as possible, and then make the voting guide as simple, so that you can vote on 30 proposals or all 300 of them.
Thanks, Bill. That was really helpful. And I was going to make the same point that thanks to the wonderful partnership that we have and the fantastic support of Bill and the others at the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, we'll have this guidance in hand before the voting opens in mid-November for all of those communities that are interested in working together with us on this, that we can distribute. So you will have that in hand. You can ask us and EECC any questions that you have going in. But as you heard from Bill, it's a really well-vetted process from experts in the field that set that simple yardstick of, does this improve efficiency or does it harm efficiency measures? And it should make it much simpler and more straightforward for everyone out there to vote on a more pro-efficiency IECC for 2021. We'll go on now to some other questions.
Yeah, so we have a quick but very important one. So to clarify, for the fees for registration, so is that per governmental agency or department or for each voting representative? So those registration fees are per department. So if you have a planning department and an energy committee, then that would be, you would be paying that fee twice. So the number of primary representatives you have is the same as the number of departments you have, and that should be the same as the number of times you're paying that registration fee.
So just to say it in an even slightly different way, and we realize it is kind of complicated, and so don't worry if you're still confused. It took us quite a while to get all of our heads wrapped around it as well. But say your planning department is one governmental member that is going to register. Say you're a community that's in that middle range, over 50,000, so you can have 8 voters per governmental member. So that governmental member, the planning department, registers with that fee. It was 200 something in that middle range, and that's all that they have to pay for that planning department. You don't have to pay it 8 times for each voting representative within the planning department. You get 8 voters for that fee of the governmental member being the planning department. And then, if you have a sustainability department that's also registering, or the mayor's office that's also registering, each of those pays that one-time fee and gets 8 voters as part of that fee. So hopefully that clarifies it, but let us know if it doesn't or if there's other questions around that could make that even clearer. And I think there was another question about who then could be those governmental members. One question I think was around energy committees. So I'll say at this point, we are not necessarily recommending that energy committees attempt to register as governmental members because it's less clear that they truly are eligible under that definition that we showed. And again, we'll send out the slides. However, if a city or town feels strongly about making that case, that they do fulfill that role in a municipality where they are enforcing or administering or developing something around the building code, and it referred to public health, welfare, and so on. And in some cases, I think that case could be made because of the way an energy committee might have been designated by a municipality to be the one developing a stretch code strategy or so on. Then I think that case could be made, and the primary member of that entity, so say it is an energy committee that works hand in hand with the municipality, and the primary member, one member of that energy committee then serves to register that energy committee, pay that one-time fee based on the population of the municipality, identify the other members that can then vote later in the summer. It is possible that the International Codes Council might question the validity of that registration. It happens once in a while, and you then just need to be prepared, and that primary representative and the municipality itself has to be comfortable with all of those voters and that member itself, the governmental member itself, in this case an energy committee, fitting that definition whereby they would be eligible to vote. So it really is on a case-by-case basis, and we're happy to consult on that and bring in IECC to consult on that as well. But it's somewhat nebulous, and that's why we're not going to say as a broad statement that yes, any energy committee can certainly be eligible to vote. But I think there are cases where if a municipality is comfortable with them fitting that definition, they could be eligible.
That was a great answer, and so we have another important question that I think that leads into. So who are the primary voters and how are they identified?
So the primary voter, it really is up to that governmental member to determine who will, really just means the person kind of responsible for administering the process for that governmental member. So let's go back to the planning department example. Say the chief planner is the primary representative. It doesn't have to be the chief planner. It has to be someone within the planning department that is willing to take on the responsibility then for vouching for identifying and vouching for the other voters that will then be identified and registered as part of the process. So again, you'll pay that one-time fee between January 1st and March 29th. You will then, that primary representative, in this case the chief planner for Town X, will be the one that registers between January 1st and March 29th. Will then, between March 29th and September 24th, sign up through the International Codes Council website. The other, say this community is one of the smaller communities, less than 50,000, so they get 4 total votes per governmental member. That primary representative, the chief planner, will then sign up to 3 other voters within the planning department, and they can identify who that is that they feel should be part of this voting effort. Really, the governmental member, I believe, and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the governmental member is the one held to that standard of who is eligible, and the voting representative should, as part of that member, thereby also be eligible and fit that definition. I don't think necessarily that each governmental member voting representative, each person in that planning department, has to show that they fit that definition in each circumstance. So if questioned, I think you do want to be able to show the planning department and the members within it do fit the definition that the International Codes Council provides. Bill, any clarifications there?
Yeah, I do think, and that was just a superb explanation of the potential of those issues that are involved. I will say, interestingly enough, however, and this is something I've found through the years, after the 2012 IECC was completed, the efficiency opponents tried to get the whole thing thrown out, and they contested a number of the 450 people who voted on the 2012 IECC and voted for efficiency, and they actually named 121 people. They went through the voting rolls and they said, we want you to look into 121 people And you know, once you determine they're not really governmental member voting representatives, we can have, you know, we're going to ask you to throw the 2012 IECC out the window. And so ICC, the International Code Council, contacted each one of those 121 individually and determined that all 121 were valid. They did not throw out a single one of them. And I think what that tells us is, first of all, that ICC, you know, the validity of the whole ICC depends on its governmental members. And the fact that their governmental members are saying, you know, this is a department or agency or a unit that is engaged in codes, and these are the people that we want to vote on behalf of each one of those governmental members from our jurisdiction. I think the presumption is always going to fall with the governmental member. And I don't know if I've ever seen any voter that or member that's been thrown out by the ICC. They tend to, I think, really recognize they know that their bread and butter really is based on those governmental memberships.
So we have a handful of questions about the stretch code and sort of why we're here looking at this code as well. So I'm just going to read all of those, and then we can address pieces of that. So the first is, as a green community, we adopted the stretch code. How does the change affect this requirement? How often is the stretch code updated? Is it true that a community can't adopt an energy code more stringent than the state stretch code? And then what can the stretch code encompass? Are there limitations?
Those are all really good questions, and I'll address some of them. I don't know if I'll address all of them to the breadth that they were possibly asked, and we can definitely delve much more into stretch code offline or in another webinar. But I will kind of lay out again how codes kind of work here in Massachusetts, because I think that's helpful as a foundation. So just a reminder that unlike many other states, in Massachusetts, we really only have two options for our building energy code. There's the base building energy code, which is largely modeled after or really adopted fully from this International Energy Conservation Code, with then a few amendments, as long as they're more stringent, which DOER consults on with the Board of Building Regulations and Standards that oversees the base building energy code. That's the code for the state, unless you decide as a community to adopt the stretch code. That's the only option you have for a building energy code that's more stringent than the base building code. If you adopt the stretch code, then you are, and that can be adopted again by either the city council or town meeting, whether you're a town or a city form of government. You then can only rescind it again by the same process. Every time the stretch code then is updated, you're automatically included in that new update. You don't then vote every time. That it's then been accepted as what the community is opted into. The stretch code is generally updated on a similar 3-year cycle, or at least that was kind of originally its intent, but it hasn't necessarily kept pace with that. The original was the 2009. That was pretty far ahead, about 20% more efficient than our base building energy code in Massachusetts. As you saw from some of Bill's slides, the 2012 and 2015 made some really good strides as compared to previous codes. And so the base code caught up a great deal with the stretch energy code, and we did not here in Massachusetts update the stretch energy code for quite a while. In recent years, it has been updated, but it's been much more incremental updates. So it affects a fewer number of the buildings, a fewer number of the sectors, and where the stretch code does not address particular buildings, it then defers to the base building energy code. And as I mentioned earlier, stretch code is kind of embedded more fully into that base building energy code now. So they kind of function together for those communities that have adopted the stretch code. So there's no prescribed time where the stretch code has to be updated. It is being considered at times, and there definitely have been those that have commented on it at Board of Building Regulations and Standards monthly meetings. And they have public comment hearings generally twice a year, usually in May and November. So this fall was actually in December last week, as opposed to November, and they're still, I believe, accepting comments. So you can send comments to the board if you have feedback that you'd like to give them, that if you'd like to have the stretch code updated more or in a different way, we're happy to share the comments that we submitted where we recommended that they start looking at a net zero type of stretch code. And so the reason we're looking at this, instead of just kind of working on the base building energy code and the stretch energy code here in Massachusetts and advocating with the BBRS to make improvements there, is we really see it as a 3- or 4-pronged process. Those points of work are very important, and we'll continue to work on making those more efficient. The IECC is a huge has a huge impact on the base building energy code, which then the stretch energy code, it tries to stretch beyond that. So if we're able to implement more pro-efficiency measures as part of the IECC, which is the process that we've been talking about today, where you all can have that effect by identifying the members in your community that can vote on that, then we as a state in 2021 will be adopting a much more efficient base building energy code that touches all 351 cities and towns as well as many other states throughout the country. So the impact is really large, and it directly affects what becomes our base building energy code and gives us a higher floor from which to stretch with our stretch energy code. And then the 4th prong is those local ordinances, the other things you can do through zoning and all of that. So that's why we feel it's a really important tool in addition to working here in the state on the base building energy code and the stretch energy code. And hopefully I addressed most of those questions, and again, happy to delve into more at another time.
Yeah, and in respect for time, I know we're very close to hitting 4 p.m. So we had a really quick one that I want to clarify about if a city that has that's more than 50,000, so could have 8 staff per department, only has 8 staff that they think would be interested in voting on this, but those staff are in different departments, can they all register as a city and pay one fee instead of paying different fees per department? And so, yes, that's an option as well. So that's why it's a good idea as a first step to sort of think about, who might be interested in this, who's been working on code and might be eligible for this, where are they fitting into different departments, and like how many people per department might you have that would be involved in this vote. So there are different ways to strategically organize that depending on what your city or town looks like. We had some other great questions about the IECC and a cost-benefit analysis for stretch code versus an updated IECC. I think we can take that offline and put that into the follow-up.
Though I'll just say again that they're not mutually exclusive. So there's no need to work on one rather than the other beyond just capacity, bandwidth, time, that type of thing. Obviously, those are constraints, but they both can move forward, and they're both really strong tools. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage communities and municipal staff and others on the call to really consider how we can move forward the International Energy Conservation Code as well as the stretch code here in Massachusetts and kind of see those as complements to one another.
And then one last one that I think I'm going to ask here, and then if we have more questions, please reach out to us and send us these questions, because all the ones we've heard today are really amazing and we want to continue these conversations. So this question is, how do we figure out who may already be registered or active as a governmental member?
Yeah, and so we do have some records from the last vote for the 2018 IECC. I will let everyone here on the phone know that unfortunately it was only around 100 people total that voted in Massachusetts for the last IECC. Now remember, Bill told us earlier that only around 500 total voted in the nation, and so 1/5 for coming from Massachusetts really is pretty good. That said, it's a small number, and I think it was even fewer than that when we actually got the totals more accurately. So there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of the numbers that we can have in bringing together those of you on the phone and others throughout the state in this effort. And it's beyond, it just being a slightly simpler process if they already had registered in the past to renew their membership as opposed to register a completely new membership. Other than that, it's not necessarily, I think, a great measure of who the governmental members or next voters should be, though it might be helpful for you and your community to have those conversations. And again, we have some of that data, so if you'd like to come talk to us about that, we can share that. But most communities will have very few, if any, who participated in the 2018 IECC vote. So I think we're mostly starting from scratch here, and we're here to help you do that. So let us know how we can be the most helpful resource in this, and we'll definitely be coming back to everyone with more resources and next steps in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to put up Kimmy and my contact info, so if you have any questions right after this, before we're able to send out that follow-up email, then please feel free to reach out directly. We're really happy to get in touch with all of you on this.
Yeah, and with that, we'll close out the webinar for today. Thank you all so much for participating in our launch to our Codes for Climate effort. Hopefully, you're starting to get a slightly better understanding of how the IECC process works. We're here to help you navigate that and take those next steps. So please be in touch with us. We look forward to being in touch with you, and thank you again for your time today.